Hello, everyone. This is Sean Richards, also known as Shady Oak, here with Manuel Goldstein, the enemy of who are you enemies of now? I know communists don't like you,
Well,
Gnostics don't like you.
it used to be Big Brother, I guess. Yeah, but I'm still the enemy of Big Brother. Yes.
Yes, definitely something to be proud of. But he was willing to join me on a live stream today, not talking about My Little Pony like prior conversations, but talking about Kung Fu Panda. Now, for those of you who've been following our DreamWorks studies for any period of time, you know the first Kung Fu Panda has a video on my channel. The second and third have notes ready, but the second one hasn't been recorded yet. So in a sense, this is going to be jumping the gun, but also giving an opportunity to do something which I encourage everyone to be doing as often as possible. When we are in a culture and a civilization, of course, that depends a lot on social media, and we like to surround ourselves with people who are going to agree with us on everything, or we only subscribe to, in a literal sense, the people that will tell us things that we already agree with, it ends up stunting our growth in the ability to disagree agreeably. And again, Manuel, you can bear testimony to the fact that when in our younger years, when conflict arises, there comes a point where you just have to shut off the camera and walk away. But we want to, of course, learn from our mistakes and also grow as people. So what we're going to be doing here today is discussing the biblical themes in Kung Fu Panda, the first and second films in particular, and perhaps the third if time allows. But in this live stream as well, we're going to be emphasizing them from different perspectives and giving you an opportunity to see that people can disagree, focus on different things as positives, and not shoot each other. Or what do they do in Germany? I know they mainly stab in England, but ever since the disarmament.
Yeah, that just took a turn I didn't expect. Yeah, well, recently there've been a lot of stabbings. Yeah.
Yeah, my time in the shade jokes have drawn attention to that.
Now they're considering outlawing butter knives. So, yeah.
Well, we'll see how that works out for him. Anyway, so since you are the guest here, it's an honor to have you as well, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you on this. Obviously, I can
Thank you.
talk to the wind about the notes that already have been taken and the video that's already been recorded on the first, which I'll get to. But regarding the first Kung Fu Panda movie, what did you find interesting that was biblical about it? And I'll share my thoughts when you're done.
A lot. A lot. You want me to go first? I was kind of hoping you would go first. Because if well, like I said, I probably have, and as you know, I probably have a bit of an unusual alternative perspective on it.
Yeah, and just for the
Um,
sake of the
I
audience, why would
don't
that be?
necessarily want to give that away. I'm assuming you have the how shall I put this? Probably the more mainstream perspective on it. So if I go first, I would have I would be giving the surprise away.
Okay, well, let me review real quick what I discussed in my biblical review as an evangelical Christian. My emphasis, obviously, is going to be centered around what can be most appropriately, in full context, attributed chapter and verse to the messages in the movie. The things that I mainly focused on were, of course, starting with 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 29. I'll read it. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. So in plain English, the idea is that when God uses people, he intentionally chooses those who would be looked down upon, the big, fat, stupid panda, because you can't take credit for it. If God does something amazing through them, it's not because they were so amazing, it's because the God that worked through them was amazing. I made a comparison to Poe and the Furious Five at the beginning of the film and noted that from anyone's perspective that would be laughable. Yet at the end of the film, he defeated an enemy that the Furious Five never could, that being Tai Lung. So to understand how that applied to our relationship with God, I used Oogway's confrontation with Tai Lung as an illustration of God resolving battles before they started, noting in 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, the weakness of God is stronger than men. The point is that God isn't foolish, God isn't weak, but it's saying that by contrast, God at his weakest is stronger than we'll ever be. The second comparison was the Furious Five versus Tai Lung. They seemed to be even-handed at first, but found out quickly with the nerve attack that they were outclassed in every way. And that was also reflective of Shifu, who was no match for Tai Lung. And as we read in Luke 6:40, a disciple is not above his teacher. Everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. So the Furious Five could only get as strong as Shifu, and Shifu wasn't strong enough to defeat Tai Lung, so ergo the transitive properly. Tai Lung greater than Shifu, Shifu greater than Furious Five, therefore Furious Five not greater than Tai Lung. Then the comparison came to Poe versus Tai Lung. He shouldn't have won, but somehow he did. Not because of the Star Wars writing, but because of the emphasis they made on the Dragon Warrior. It had nothing to do with his skills or talents, but based on two realities. Who was his teacher, which alone was not enough, as we saw with the Furious Five, but even if a perfect teacher was there, you could just not listen to what they have to say. He had a good teacher, though, and that was acknowledged. The second was what his calling was, and that was the difference between him and Tai Lung. Tai Lung wasn't chosen to be the Dragon Warrior, and for good reason. Poe was chosen by Oogway to be the Dragon Warrior, and for a reason, just like God chose you and me. And what was the reason? I referenced Romans 8:28 through 30, knowing that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he called, he justified, those he justified, he glorified. So the idea is that our calling isn't to have the dragon scroll, but to be conformed, transformed literally, into the image of the Son, Jesus Christ. So if the process then isn't just to, go to the birthplace of harmony and focus, the birthplace of kung fu, the place, what was it called? We do not wash our pits in the pools of, what did they call it again? In the first film?
I just watched it. I actually just watched it for the first time, but I can't remember. I know what you mean, which scene you mean, but
Yeah, it
I
looked
don't
like the
remember
yin
the
yang thing
wording.
there. Well, the point was this. Everyone is available to respond to this kind of calling. Just like Tigress was always going to be Tigress, Poe was always going to be Poe, Tai Lung was always going to be Tai Lung, and they were going to remain so with or without the Dragon Scroll. If Tigress was chosen, what would make her the Dragon Warrior wasn't that she ate so little or trained so hard. What made Tai Lung not the Dragon Warrior wasn't because he trained hard. Poe, who he was by nature, was something that was unique. There was no secret ingredient. So the one who again missed out on and sought all his life to get a book that never understood its message is in the same way where we are looking at the Bible. If God is, of course, the reason why we were created to be conformed to the image of his Son, if he's the one doing that work in us, then there is no special seminary, there is no special calling or training. You just need to be who God created you to be. And that, of course, starts with the Holy Spirit. And so, in a sense, you can say there's a secret ingredient, but it's available to everybody, so it's not unique. And that's where I tied it into. We can't forgive ourselves of our sins, overcome the forces of darkness alone, or even keep ourselves alive one moment longer than when our time comes. So the takeaways were this. Our hope isn't in ourselves. Anyone who would say, just looking at yourself and believe in yourself, I'd say that's a bad idea. Our hope is in two things: our teacher, the one who leads us into all truth, see John 14 regarding the Holy Spirit, and his calling. You've been chosen as the Dragon Warrior. If it's not to, again, condemn us for our sin, but to conform us to the person who loves and calls us to depend on him like a parent does a child, I ended with Matthew 18, which again notes that unless you become as a child, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. What's important about that isn't to say, like, perform a Benjamin Button scenario and devolve in age, but the principle is, who you, like a child, you depend on your parent, you're loved, and you're provided for. That's the emphasis. So regarding the first Kung Fu Panda movie, those were the things I liked. the principle of the secret ingredient, the idea of Oogway choosing Poe, not because he was capable, but because he had the right heart and character to teach a lesson to everyone else, which will tie into the third. But the uh, opinions, again, remain my own, hopefully informed, and with scripture to back them up. But now I think is your turn. Give us the surprise you've been holding out on since we started.
Well, now I build it up too much. I didn't intend that either.
Don't believe the
But
hype.
like I told you, I always liked Siskel and Ebert, and I always liked when they had different opinions. And I do have a different opinion, and the surprise kind of is, well, I actually didn't like the movies.
I didn't like the fourth, and I didn't like the third as much.
I haven't seen the four. I have seen the first three, because I thought we were gonna talk about the first three,
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
So I didn't think it was necessary to watch the fourth. Fourth. Um, and I've only watched it now. My wife has always my wife for like 10 years she's been calling me Kung Fu Panda, and I didn't even know what that was referencing. so I
Hopefully
so I'm
endearing.
glad I finally got around to actually watch it. Um, and another friend of mine, he also told me, "Oh yeah, watch this movie. It's gonna be great. You're gonna love it," and so on. And I did, and I didn't like it. And the reason I didn't like it is, in my opinion, well, it's actually because, mm, well, because I actually feel, and maybe that's the better surprise. I feel it's actually not in line with mainstream Christianity.
Tell us how.
Um, yeah, I mean, I can see, and I agree with you. It does have Christian themes. It does, and I can see uh, people saying that. Watching the movie, and and some people also told me it has Buddhist elements. But I disagree with that as well. I don't think it has Buddhist elements, and I don't think it has mainstream Christian elements.
Mm.
To say it directly, I think it mainly has Gnostic Christian elements.
Ooh,
And
for those
as you
listening,
know,
what does that mean?
yeah, well, I don't have to explain it to you, but okay, maybe some people don't. But actually, most people, I talk about Gnosticism all the time, so probably most of my viewers know what that is anyway. But it's easy to explain. It's basically a Christian heresy,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, the
It's
earliest.
it's not a new thing at all. But I feel, and feel free to disagree with me, but I feel it's actually getting more popular in popular culture.
Oh yeah, 100% agree.
And it's an ancient Christian heresy from like the second century,
Hmm.
and Saint Irenaeus already completely exposed it. Back then,
Yeah.
he wrote a 5-volume book exposing it completely. But for some weird reason, it keeps popping up. And I feel all of the Kung Fu Panda movies, um, they have Christian themes, but they actually have Gnostic Christian themes, and very much so. And okay, now I have to explain why.
And
um,
just for the benefit of the audience, Gnostic, it comes from the word gnosis. It's a Greek word. And think like it's spelled Gnosis, gnosis. The idea is that silent G. It's meant to speak of hidden knowledge or secret truth that are only reserved for the elite. So, for example, Mormonism would be an excellent example of Gnostic influence in the world today. The idea is centered around, okay, if you're a part of our special group, if you're a part of our special organization, if you trust these anointed prophets to give you the true revelation of God, then you get into all these bizarre ideas that ultimately would lead you to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament is this evil rebel against the iterations and archons that are ultimately gods so separate and so distant from a material universe that it ultimately reveals to you the secret knowledge that the physical is evil and the spiritual is the true good. This led people in Gnostic heresies and cults to go one of two directions. It was either complete abstinence from the flesh, that they would become monks and ascetics. They would deny themselves everything because that was evil. You wanted nothing to do with the physical. Or it led people into total debauchery and hedonism. This life doesn't matter because the evil, when it ultimately is separated from us, when we physically die or return to the spiritual, so live like a hog, do what you want. And this led to a lot of Christian groups needing to be directly reprimanded by early church fathers and even books in the New Testament, where Paul the Apostle has to directly say it's not a sin to be married. In First Timothy chapter 4, 1 through 5, he made the special emphasis in saying food is not evil. It's something God created to be enjoyed. Marriage is not evil. It's something that God considers honorable above all. Read Hebrews. These sort of things were creeping into the church because it was assuming Greek culture, Greek influence, as opposed to Hebrew, Jewish influence, which the Old Testament and New are all based on. So, you coming out from that background, what did you see that was Gnostic and that we need to be careful about in Kung Fu Panda?
Everything, everything.
Everything.
And actually, I feel that the later movies are kind of just a repetition of the first two.
Mhm.
Um, I felt the villain in the third movie was just basically just a combination of the villain in the first and second movie. And of course, since you know Japanese and maybe you also know a little Chinese, you probably noticed that, and since you just explained Gnosticism a little bit, you've probably noticed that the villain in the second movie is called Shun.
Mhm.
You know
Means
what that
God.
means, right?
God.
Right, right. And just in case some people might not be able to speak Chinese, they also call him Lord.
Mhm.
He's called Lord Shun. And it's not directly said that he lives in heaven, but it looks like heaven. I mean, and when his like minions attack, they attack from above. It looks like they come flying down from the clouds. And I believe those are the archons, keeping with the Gnostic themes. And of course, Shun is the demiurge. The Gnostic demiurge, the Gnostic version of Jehovah, because they, of course, Shun is the villain, but to Gnostics, God is the villain.
And for the sake of those listening again, the demiurge is actually a term that was coined by Aristotle. It was referencing the divine reaching down to earth, which the Gnostics believed made him evil because interaction with the physical was the foundation of everything going wrong. The idea that we would be human and divine, that Jesus was the God man. They couldn't reconcile that. He either had to be totally divine, which was their argument, and even made stories saying he was not human at all when he walked. He didn't leave footprints. When he, was crucified, obviously, they said that someone had to take his place because you can't crucify a spiritual entity. These are the kind of ideas that he's talking about. The demiurge is what they would refer to the God of the Old Testament as being evil because he involved himself with the physical, the yucky world.
Right, right. Gnostics hate the material world. They and they want to transcend it, and they want to negate it. And I feel in a way we don't even have to really explain Gnosticism. We just, we can assume everyone has at least watched the Matrix movie, right? And that explains Gnosticism even better than Kung Fu Panda. Um, but I feel Kung Fu Panda is just as Gnostic. But the Matrix gives a better explanation of what Gnosticism is. So if people are still wondering what is Gnosticism, just watch the Matrix movie. It is that.
The hidden world versus the true world. You want to transcend the physical, not live only for the flesh, but for reality. And this reality is anointed to the special few. And if you want to be a part of it, take the red pill, that idea.
Right, and Neo is of course their version of the Messiah, but I feel Neo is also it's all the same character. Neo in the Matrix, um, the Lego guy in the Lego movie. What was his name?
Emmett.
Bukowski. Emmett Bukowski. Right. I thought that kind of sounded like Emmett. Kind of reminded me. Sounded like everyman because everyone can be him, and that was also kind of the message in the Matrix movie. Everyone can be the chosen one. You know, that's the Gnostic message. I mean, obviously, that's not the mainstream Christian message. I don't agree with that,
But
but
you reveal the hidden
I
message that
feel
makes you
that's
the Messiah.
what they're trying to tell people. That was his defining characteristic of all three characters of Neo, of Emmett in the Lego movie, and of the Panda, Paul the Panda. Their defining characteristic, or what makes them special, what makes them the chosen one, is that they're actually not special at all. And that's kind of the Gnostic message. Is obviously, Poe is the Christ-like figure, is the Messiah-like figure, just like Neo and just like Emmett. Um, but he's not the mainstream Christian Christ. He's the Gnostic Christ, and the Gnostic message is: if you have the divine knowledge, the gnosis, then you can save yourself. You don't need these external gods. You know, you don't need Jesus. You don't need Jehovah. You can save yourself. You know, all you need is the secret knowledge, the gnosis, represented by the scroll in the first movie, in the first Kung Fu Panda movie. Yeah, and that's what he does. He saves himself through the gnosis, through the sacred knowledge. Of course, at the end of the movie, it's revealed that there's actually nothing in the scroll. But that's not actually true. It's a mirror. So again, the message is you can save yourself. You know, you don't need the evil demiurge that they demonize in the second movie. You can save yourself. You can be your own Messiah. You don't need an external Messiah. You can be your own Messiah. And yeah, that's what, from a Gnostic perspective, that's what I feel Poe represents. He represents the Gnostic Messiah. And just like Neo, we also see him basically gain supernormal abilities. But the way this works, or the way Gnostic think that it works, because they reject the material world. The message in all these movies is basically, if you think you're God and if you think you have superpowers, then you will have them. Because objective material physical reality does not exist in their weird
Philosophy.
mind. Only the mind exists in their mind. So that's when that's why at the end of Kung Fu Panda 1, when Poe manages to convince himself that he has those superpowers, he gains them. Yeah, and in the third movie, of course, now you might be asking, well, if it's that simple, how come everyone who truly, I mean, there are a lot of Gnostics who believe that, how come they don't have actual superpowers? Well, they would argue, well, that's because you don't believe we do. It's your fault. It's your fault for doubting us, because they reject objective physical reality. Whatever is in the minds of everyone, that becomes the reality. So the reason they don't have superpowers is because there are still doubters and they're still believers in old ancient religion, in mainstream religions. They're still believers in Jehovah, and the people who believe in Jehovah, they of course believe Jehovah is God. They don't believe these Gnostics are God, and because in their mind they don't affirm them, that's why they're not able to do it. And you can see
Gospel
that
according
very
to
well.
Kanye West.
I don't even know who that is, but probably a Gnostic. Uh, you can see that very well in the third movie.
Mhm.
Um,
We'll talk about that when we
where
get there.
well, let me just say this. In the third movie, Poe isn't strong enough to defeat the bad guy, and So, but he has like, all he has his village and all his people, and they all kind of join together, and they all believe in him, and they all reinforce him, and that's what Gnostics think they need. They think if everyone agrees with them and kind of and agrees with them in denying the physical reality, which they don't believe in, then the physical reality will be meaningless, and everyone can basically have whatever superpowers they want and will be like God.
Yeah, and the idea, of course, of the Gnostic could also be that we have no need to demonstrate these superpowers because our true power is in the spiritual, not in the visible, not in the tangible. Exercising authority over it would basically be meaningless to the more ascetic group. But when it comes to, and again, the Gnostic teachings, and this is in no way to undermine you, but for people who want to read up on these philosophies and ideas in their full bloom, you want to read the pseudepigraphal and heretical sources like the Acts of Peter, the Apocalypse of James, these second and third century writings that were meant to parodize what Christians were teaching by incorporating these false teachings and ideas into them. And the big emphasis, like Emmanuel was talking about, is centered around the idea that everyone's supernatural to a degree, but that's the problem. We need to exercise our total dominion, not, of course, allow these other conflicting ideas, especially that evil Old Testament God, those evil Jews, to, and by the way, I'm not going on an anti-Semitic rant here. We're emphasizing the idea that the Gnostics hated Israel because they made an emphasis on the physical and spiritual both being important. Their emphasis was the spiritual is the only thing that's important, and any god that would involve himself with the physical would be by definition evil because they serve the greater gods and goddesses, what they would call the archons and the iterations and so forth. So going then to the point of emphasis, when we are talking about points of disagreement, Manuel is talking about this from an informed perspective, saying, I don't want people to miss an underlying and corrupt idea that's being sugar-coated, that's being wrapped in these positive ideas that I started with. Now, the question then is,
Right, you
and
worded that better than me.
yeah, well, speaker, the question, though, is in his emphasis on the negative, does that demonstrate that I'm wrong? And he would be the first to say not at all. The question is, and why I'm arguing there is something good to be taken from it, isn't to say that there is a perpendicular story, that these are intersecting, that Kung Fu Panda is 100% the Christian message. When I talk about anime or Disney or Star Wars or whatever, it's all going to be centered around that thing that I'm choosing is a reason to like this, just like anyone else would enjoy anything. I like that aspect of this. It resonates with something in me. And the thing in me, the thing that hopefully all of you listening have in common, is the Christian worldview. An informed Christian worldview, however, is going to exercise what we call discernment, asking the question, okay, that's good, but is everything about this good? And we'd say certainly not. And I can, again, join in bashing the first Kung Fu Panda movie and noting that there are some undecidedly Hindu themes, that the separation of self or this attachment to the dragon scroll was what made Tai Lung evil. The principle and idea of meditation and preservation was what gave Tai Lung his strength. All of these references to chi and so forth, the wuxi finger hold and the releasing of light, immediately transporting him to the spirit world, which we got more information on in the third movie. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's all, again, not biblical, but some of it can be. And what we need to be able to say is, I'm mature and informed enough to know where the good starts and the good ends. And that's important. So, noting this, and again, wanting to be informed, read things if these things interest you regarding the Gnostic sources and being able to say from an informed perspective, chapter and verse, that is not the Bible. And there's a reason for it. The most obvious was when they said this was the Apocalypse according to James or the Acts of Peter. They were using these names, and this is important for church history as well as understanding the Bible. They were using these names in order to make the books popular. Why? Because everyone knew James, the leader of the early church, the half biological brother of Jesus of Nazareth, eyewitness of the resurrection, the apostle Peter, the first of the apostles, the one Jesus specifically sought out after his resurrection. All of these things were important. So the idea of, oh, we have another writing from Peter, I want to read this. Two problems. Peter had been dead for over 100 years by the time the Apocalypse of Peter and the Acts of Peter were written. So unless something funky happened, they went to his tomb and, his like decaying bone box or something wrote out like some D&D necromancy spell, a new book that totally contradicted everything that was written before it, that'd be the second problem. We need to be able to say, if the cover page is a lie, what does that say about the pages behind it? Just saying. The second issue is, of course, when these books, referring to the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the letters to the churches, the book of Revelation, the reason these were accepted is because they had standards that go all the way back to Moses. I'm writing my first book on this, by the way. When they are talking about canon, something that measures up, that's what canon means, the measuring stick. It was ultimately to stand or fall on their ability to perform miracles, to back up God's words with deeds. It was their consistency with Old Testament doctrine. It was their accountability. They would be executed if they did a false prophecy in the name of Yahweh or Jehovah. And of course, that this accountability would produce accuracy. They didn't falsely report things. Now, skeptics will try to jump on that and say, well, here's an error and here's a textual variant. Textual variant isn't an error. As a copyist error. John 5:4 is an example of this, where it just explains why the lame man wanted to get into the water. Early manuscripts don't have it. A manuscript, our earliest, includes it as a scribal note, and later manuscripts describe it as a verse. We know what went wrong. But if we, again, assume, because a note was confused as a verse, what does that say about the rest of the Bible? I don't know. What do you have evidence for? The reason we say John 5:4 is most likely a scribal note is because we can actually prove that. As far as the actual veracity of the scriptures, we have more reason to trust its preservation than anything else in ancient history, and that's because of the sheer volume of copies. But note that point, and why I'd again agree with Emmanuel and why he can still agree with me without contradicting himself, is if we're going to enjoy something, we want to focus on the good. That's my preference. But we also need to be aware of the bad, and the best way to spot a lie is to know the real deal. The reason those books are in our Bible is because they measured up. The reason the Apocalypse of James, the Acts of Peter aren't is because, first of all, you read them and they are weird. And secondly, it's because they are lying about their authorship in order to be taken seriously. That's not one, but three marks against them because they're avoiding accountability, no miracles to back them up, and they are making false reports for credibility. Before we get into the second one, and I will note that detail about Shen, is there anything else you want to say before we do that?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't exclusively focus on the first one, because I feel they are all kind of interconnected, and like I said, the third movie is basically just the first two again. So at least that's how I felt. So I was kind of talking about all the first three movies. I wasn't talking about the fourth one because I haven't seen that one yet. But and yeah, I was talking about the first three, and I feel they all have the same Gnostic message. But I agree with what you just said, and I agree with what you said in the beginning as well. Right? Just because there are these Gnostic themes, that doesn't mean that there aren't positive themes as well, and that doesn't mean we have to reject the positive themes. I'm not saying that. And I agree with you, and I agree with you about the positive themes. So yeah, and talking about the spiritual realm being the true realm, we can see that very well in the third movie. But okay, if you want to talk specifically about the third movie, we can talk about that then. But the third movie really emphasizes that a lot as well. It emphasizes the spirit realm. They actually call it the spirit realm.
Yeah, and total
Um,
indifference towards the physical life given the lifestyle of the pandas.
right, right. So, oh, and before I forget it, tell me when you finish your book. I'm gonna buy it.
I'll uh, I'll
Because that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'll let you know. I'm about a third of the way through it, but the hardest part about doing something that is non-fictional is because you want to give a lot of citations, so I have to read multiple books before writing my book to get all the page numbers right and stuff. So it's a snail's pace process. But yeah, it's important to understand the difference as well. And it's also why I haven't done studies on things that I could definitely talk about. Stuff like Has Been Hotel, for instance. There's people who want me to
Oh dear.
discuss it. But the problem is, it's like trying to find a diamond ring in a septic tank. I love the idea of redemption, but there's also the idea of, making Lucifer out to be the underdog and the guy who was given the bad rap, the idea of this hedonist relationship being the underpinning and motivation that made them the good guy as opposed to the bad guy, the principle of, well, first of all, people in hell being even wanting to be redeemed, which is why I thought the pilot it was a lot better than the series. But and I did find a loophole. We may get the chance to talk about it, but I think it's a good thing to understand as you're talking about Gnostic influence and being aware of the lies that have been told throughout history. My goal and emphasis has always been if they know the truth, they'll spot the differences. But Has Been Hotel's great insight to stuff like Kabbalic mysticism and Jewish demonology, and those are important things to know for no other reason than being able to spot people who confuse it with the Bible and saying they didn't say that was legitimate, and there was a reason for that. So, want to go on to the second one real quick, or do you have anything else to say?
Uh, well, like I said, I'm basically already including the second one. Um, but yeah, since there's one character that's mainly in the first one, you just mentioned Lucifer.
Hmm.
I feel he's also in Kung Fu Panda in the first one.
And what was his representative?
Uguay.
Oogway? Okay,
Mhm.
what made him the son of the morning in that?
Now I have to watch it again and watch out for Morning Star symbolism. There was some Morning Star symbolism in it as well. But I think that was actually in the third one. Um, no, in the second one, the Morning Star symbolism was very strong in the second one. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, no, like Shun is God, but they see him as the demiurge.
The
Uh,
word means God.
Panda, right? The panda, well, it's their view. None of this is big biblical. It's not gonna be correct. It's their view. It's what Gnostics believe. So, yeah. So I'm not saying that's how it is. That's how they see it. Um, the panda is the Messiah, who the Messiah. Well, because they see, like I said, they see everyone as having the potential to become his own Messiah and be responsible for his own salvation through the Gnosis, represented by the scroll. And Uguay is Lucifer. You can, we talked about, it's literally called, what's it called? The tree, the peach tree, okay, the peach tree. But forget about the kind of fruit doesn't matter because, as you know, the Bible doesn't. Usually, it's an apple tree, but the Bible never says it's an apple tree, so it might as well be a peach tree, right?
Might as
So
well.
it's called the tree of heavenly wisdom.
Hmm.
So it's the wisdom tree.
Well,
Uh,
here's where you have to pay attention to the technicalities. In Genesis 2, what is the tree of life contrasted with? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When we're talking about wisdom, wisdom isn't exclusively knowledge, read Proverbs, but the idea of wisdom is a practical application of the knowledge that you have. So when we're talking about the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, what was introduced when Adam and Eve took of the fruit. It wasn't necessarily that this was some magical property tree. The reason it was forbidden was because Adam and Eve were created to reflect the image of God. God is a relational being, is of course not going to be the creepy stalker girlfriend that's going to eliminate all competition like Yandere Simulator or something. The idea is when Adam and Eve, man and woman, were given the opportunity to fellowship with God, to walk with him in the cool of the day, as we read in Genesis 3, it was all based on their ability to choose the tree of life as opposed to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, note this point, with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what would they gain if, even if we grant that it had mystical properties, which I don't? Didn't they already know God? Thus, they knew good. But the problem was, in taking the tree, they gained evil. They introduced evil. What I would naturally take, and this is the consensus view, is, or the orthodox view rather, popular vote doesn't prove anything, is the principle that when they rebelled against God, that is what introduced the fall. God told them, this is what you don't do. This is what violates the relationship. This is our covenant. This is the first dispensation of salvation for mankind. Here's what you do. Here's what you don't do. You obey, you're blessed. You disobey, you're cursed. We're under a similar covenant. Salvation's through Jesus. You obey that, you're blessed. You disobey that, you're cursed. But the idea,
I agree. I
yeah,
agree. But that's the Orthodox Christian view.
yeah, and then of course in
I'm trying to
Gnosticism,
explain the Gnostic view.
yeah, and that's why I just want to make sure. Know the truth. Now here's the deviation. What was the Gnostic handling? And a good movie that illustrates this is the Noah film with Russell Crowe. What was the Gnostic view about Jehovah holding out on mankind, keeping them from knowledge that ended up making Lucifer the good guy?
Right, right. You can see that very well in the second Kung Fu Panda movie, where I feel they just totally demonized God. But anyway, Lucifer they regard as God, they regard as the bad guy, sort of. Oh, it's an oversimplification. And Lucifer, they basically regard as the good guy, which is why I think Oogway is Lucifer. And he literally, if you paid attention to the first movie, he literally gives the fruit of the tree of wisdom, of heavenly wisdom, to the panda.
Yeah, and
And
again, it's a vague reference, but everyone here understands your point. When we're talking about the parallels, it's a lot of themes to be sensitive to. The idea isn't that fruit is the means to achieve godhood. Most aren't going to be looking for that. But understand, and I'll just write it out here since I don't have a uh,
and that's also why I
screen here.
need to address all the movies at the same time, because um, it's not some aspects of the character aren't explained in the first movie, but they were explained in the second or the third movie.
Yeah.
So I kind of have to include the other movies as well, because in the third movie, we see that Oogway is in the spirit realm.
Hmm.
Um, so he's like a spiritual being.
I can't write it
Um,
backwards, but
right,
understand this is the assumption. Spirit is
right,
good, physical is evil. So
right,
when Oogway is introducing the spiritual, that's what makes him the good guy. When Oogway is introducing the physical, that's what makes him the bad guy. When God is physical, they would take that to mean, Gnostics, that evil is taking place. Why? Because physical equals evil. We don't grant that. But the spirit being evil or being good, why then would they say Lucifer's the bad guy? Because Lucifer is not a physical being. He's pure spirit. And that's the point of emphasis. He must be the good guy. And they'll we're willing to
right,
turn the Bible on its head in order to prove it.
right. Um, like I said, he gives the fruit from the tree of heavenly wisdom to Panda, and he also gives the well the sacred secret scroll of Gnostic wisdom to Panda as well. Well, basically, he's the one who facilitates all that.
And before
Uh,
anyone listening says, I think you're reading a bit much into it, understand he's using the same methodology I am in the negative to the positive. He wants people to be aware of a deception, so he's going to draw attention to themes that could be associated with Gnosticism. Notice could be is the qualifier. I'm not
Right.
saying that the DreamWorks writers intended Kung Fu Panda to be biblical, but every single screenwriter worth his salt knows there is one and only one story worth telling, and that's of the suffering servant who gives his life for those he loves and ultimately reveals himself to be God. The question is, where does the good start and the bad end? His goal is to draw attention to the evil. My goal is to draw attention to the good. He's no more being a conspiracy theorist than I am in being altruistic.
Uh, right. And obviously, I don't agree with Gnostics. The whole reason I'm bringing this up is, right, because I want people to be aware of it. Because a lot of these movies, these are basically kids' movies,
Mhm.
and they work. All these themes work on a subliminal level, so people get indoctrinated in that kind of with that kind of stuff, and they're not even necessarily aware of it. And so I want to make them aware because I obviously disagree with the Gnostics. Um,
May your tribe increase. Well, going to the second movie then, and this is where we can get
one
more.
more thing. One
Go
more
ahead.
thing. It's a minor thing, but if you keep all the other aspects in mind, um, Uguay, I know he's a turtle, but he looks like a snake. Especially there are some shots, especially with the tree, where his neck is unnaturally long, and he looks like a snake. Okay, so that's it.
And for the benefit of those listening, snake or serpent in Eden doesn't mean he was literally a snake. The word in Hebrew is nahash. The word means shining one. It can refer to snakes being slimy little noodles, but the idea is that he's, of course, entity that would be a parallel with those conniving underminers.
They actually know that as well, and they actually included the Shining one as well, because in the third movie, in the Spirit Realm, Panda notes how shining and shiny Oogway is.
Yeah.
So they're actually aware of that.
So you're being sensitive to etymology, the origins of words. I'm being sensitive to biblical themes and asking, where is the good in this? The second movie, I think, and again, as far as what they have going for or against them, it was the most well made of the four movies. The second Kung Fu Panda was a phenomenal story. The point of emphasis, obviously, is going to be drawn to, and I'll make an individual video uploading this later, but the idea of even the choreography, the nature of the peacock trying to distract and him trying to deceive and draw attention away from his actual attacks, Poe being, of course, more reactionary in his attacks rather than aggressive, Tigress and her being more empathetic and noting that she didn't just go outright and destroy people. But even the way that they fought, is my point, is relevant to how they wrote their characters, and not a single character, what be it the wolf captain or Shen or Poe or Tigress or even the Rhino. Everyone got a character arc, even Shifu. So full marks for that as far as a good story. But the positive thing that I wanted to draw attention to in the second Kung Fu Panda was that it was all the attitude or perspective that comes with suffering and the negative or positive impacts that produces. I'll go into more detail again in the actual study, but I wanted to use the life of Joseph, Genesis chapter 37 through 50, as the kind of format of someone who went through the ringer, went through everything that the world could supposedly use to tear him down, and what, quoting Genesis 50 again, says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And that was his perspective that spared him bitterness, much like Poe. However, the takeaway that I wanted to draw attention to wasn't that Poe was the messianic figure. I actually thought the best reference to Jesus Christ in Kung Fu Panda 2 was Tigress, and here's why. Shen was bitter as a result of his perspective towards suffering. He was shown by an oracle his defeat at the hands of a warrior of black and white. And as a callback to Uguay's statement in the first film, one often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it. The desire he had to prevent future suffering, by eliminating its cause is a mindset that many believe will solve the problem. The problem is, again, especially if you have a Hindu or a Buddhist background, their solution to suffering actually perpetuates the suffering. The idea of dukkha, or the negativity in your spirit, is all centered around, according to the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhuta is desire or attachment. And if you eliminate desire and attachment, you just stop caring about everything, then suddenly nothing hurts. And of course, if you look at the slums of Calcutta, being indifferent towards the suffering of people doesn't make their lives any better, any more than his efforts and attempts to eliminate the pandas made him suddenly the good guy. It was the fact that he was a genocidal scumbag that the warrior of black and white had to put him down. He became the reason he was an evil to be eliminated. So the question in that is, what should you try to prevent further or future evil? The mistake in that mindset is you don't know the purpose those things being allowed to take place are. He was the reason he was going to be defeated. He assumed the dragon warrior was only seeking to overthrow him because he was as much a power-hungry lunatic as he was. So the first comparison to Joseph is that he had prophetic dreams, like the oracle. But he was shown a future that he didn't fully understand. He said, I saw the sheaves of wheat we were gathering in the field, and all of yours bowed down to mine. Then he had another dream where he saw the sun, moon, and stars all bowing down to him, and Jacob, his father, rightly interpreted it, and this is relevant in Revelation 12, as your mother and I and your 11 brothers are going to bow down to you. But he kept the matter in mind. Joseph had this idea that his family was going to be bowing down to him. And him sharing that ended up causing the suffering that led him into Egypt. They hated him for it. They were bitter. They were jealous of him. So you see an interesting parallel with Shin in that. Are you holding up notes here? Because we don't read it on the screen there. Oh, King Herod? Oh, boy. I'll look forward to hearing your reference to that. The second point I'd make in the study is, how did Poe see suffering? Just like Shifu's lesson of achieving inner peace was a problem that both of them had to overcome, one at a much younger age, but all centered around trauma that he wasn't willing to face. And much like Joseph, and noting the parallels to his life, when he pursued excellence and attitude in his fields, it didn't prevent any suffering from happening. Obviously, his just willingness to adopt his new goose father and embrace the life of noodles was something that he was equipped for, just like Joseph was initially Potiphar's servant, and he was comfortable with that. It didn't mean that his wife wasn't a cougar. And likewise, when he was put into prison and he served in excellence, it didn't mean that the people he was jailed with, when they were ultimately released and sent to Pharaoh, weren't ultimately going to forget about him until the time was right. The attitude and perspective that Poe had, that was noting peace, and this is again noted in the book of Philippians, the peace of God that passes all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus, is the attitude of not being indifferent, but understanding the perspective that the process is worth it. Suffering in the future, Shen's perspective, suffering in the present. What's the biblical attitude? It's understanding, to quote my namesake, Pastor Chuck Smith, God has a purpose and a plan. He can be trusted with my future as much as my present. That's my impression of him, by the way. So the idea of Poe being able to say, much like Joseph, yes, working in the noodle shop isn't quote unquote fun, but what did it get? It created relationships like that of his father, which we saw relevant in the first. When he became a member of the Furious Five, and of course he was able to develop positive relationships with all of them, Tigress especially, shippers rejoice, was what? That this was something that could form meaningful relationships. It's ultimately centered around and built on, what can God do with me where I'm at in the here and now? And I'll give more details and citation for that in the actual video. The third one, though, and this was the most important, was Tigress. How did she see suffering? Obviously, we can talk about her, punching the tree until the point where her hands were numb and she basically had perpetual boxing gloves and sparring partners all to the end. And again, awesome. There was the idea of the to Kung Fu masters throwing him out of the cell, and her being so well trained that she was able to catch him with ease, and Po giving direct testimony. You see that? It's called being awesome. And much like with Joseph and his anointing, we can talk about him being the second in command of Egypt. But remember, Tigris is the most Christ-like of the three, according to my perspective. So the point that I'd want to drive home is not her being the lion of the tribe of Judah, not her being the most powerful of the group as far as sheer force is concerned, or technique and skill. Much like Jesus, he doesn't have to tell you that he is powerful. He's literally the creator. In 2 Thessalonians 2, we're told that he's going to wipe out entire armies just by showing up and talking. The voice that spoke the universe into existence will say, "You're done," and the rest is going to be explained in Revelation, I think it's 15. The blood will be up to the horse's bridle for the basically entire valley of Megiddo. And that's an Old Testament reference, by the way. But the point is this: the point that made Tigris most like Christ was the hardcore do understand. And that's where I drive the point to Hebrews chapter 4, and noting that we do not have a high priest who is not able to sympathize or empathize with our weaknesses, for he was tempted in all ways as we are, yet without sin. Poe doesn't know what it's like to punch a tree to the point where his hands are numb, but he does have some idea of combat skills. Poe doesn't understand what it's like to be put through all of the heartache and rejection that Tigris overcame when being raised by Shifu, but he understands at least what it's like to be separated from his family. Tigris, and again, we can get into the short series that kind of undermined it a little bit, in my opinion, but that's another conversation, of her being empathetic, having absolute power, rushing at Poe, and everyone expecting her to just destroy him, but instead giving him a hug. And I think that's the greatest demonstration of Christ-like character, is being the kind of person who has all power, but instead chooses to comfort, that is willing to suffer with all of us, but is ultimately just trying to equip us for greater fellowship with him. His emphasis and goal of his power is in a relationship and restoration, not on just showing who's boss, because we know Jesus can do that if he wants to, but his goal is not in showing his power. His glory is in our restoration. See 2 Peter chapter 3 and Ezekiel 33 and verse 11. But the point, I think, is most important in that is, where is Jesus in the midst of this, and how is he properly represented as he revealed himself in history? Now, regarding Shen, yes, you are right. It is Chinese for the term God. But I think that, and I will mention this, Shen deserves a Bible study all on his own, because that is just a phenomenally written villain. But what's interesting about that, and this is important, is that when Satan is given his full leave, and this is true even today, we read in 2 Corinthians that his specialty is to look and sound and act as much like the good guy as possible. Ministers of Satan look like apostles of Jesus Christ. And no wonder, this is a quote, "For Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light." So the appearance of good, the appearance of beauty, even the name of God, isn't a conclusion, isn't a fact. The question is their character, their doctrine, their actions. So when someone puts themselves forward as, "I'm the man of God," or "I have a new revelation of Jesus Christ," don't despise prophecies. 1 Thessalonians 5:19 through 21 says, "Test all things, hold fast what is good, abstain from every form of evil." And if his opening message is, "God told me to go and exterminate an entire ethnicity because I have a paranoid delusion of them potentially, possibly," you should already be leaving. So the point being made is just that. The thief does not come except to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus says, "I have come that they may have life and may have it more abundantly." If someone's going to be a follower of Jesus, you don't look at their name tag. You don't look at their reputation. You don't even necessarily look at the way they portray themselves. The Antichrist is going to look as much like Jesus Christ as possible. He's going to be a good guy, one who brings peace. When he does his things, the mark of the beast system, for example, did you know that that's a reference to the book of Ezekiel, when God separated his people from his wrath? When Revelation 7 notes, again, before the mark of the beast is introduced, God's going to mark his people first. Satan's never had an original thought in his mind. and his goal is to be the most like God as possible, which is why, in reference to Daniel 7, the names that are written on him are blasphemous. He calls himself Jehovah, but the reality is he's not. We don't judge that by his name, but by his character, and that's what's key. All right, anything to add or emphasize that you didn't already talk about in the second movie?
Well, like as you know, I have a different perspective, or I try to bring up a different perspective, um, which um, which doesn't mean that I disagree with your perspective. I mean, you can get both of these things out of it, but both of these things are present. Um, so yeah, and especially in the second movie, there is one aspect which you haven't mentioned yet, and that's why I wrote it down wrote it down in my notepad. Um, which I feel as well is in line with uh, the mainstream Christian Jesus. And that's the thing with King Herod.
Luke chapter
And
2.
no, yeah, killing. This is now gets so dark, and you kind of mentioned it already a little bit. And of course, I want to point out in the Gnostic perspective, you're all about the mainstream Christian perspective on it. I want to point out the Gnostic perspective on it, and of course, the Gnostics, like I said, they kind of hate Jehovah, or
Mm-hmm.
kind of hate the God of the Old Testament, and they see him as this evil villain who commits all this genocide
Because
and
he's
so
involved with the physical. Doesn't have anything to do with his actions, just his nature.
on. And yeah, and of course, Shun basically, well, he tries to kill all the pandas because there was a sounds familiar. So there is a prophecy that there's going to be like a panda that's going to defeat him or something like that.
Someone's going to
And
take his power away. How do I
yeah,
prevent that? I'll wipe them all out.
right. So
Where's the
so he
Messiah
killed
to be born? Bethlehem. Kill
he,
all the
he
kids
killed
2 years and under.
right. He kills all the baby pandas like King Herod, and yeah. But here you can also see like I agree that these the references to Christ aren't limited to Paul the Panda, but here we have a very obvious, very direct mainstream Christian reference to mainstream Christian Jesus in the Panda with the Panda with the with the killing of the baby pandas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my mistake, Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 through 18. And there's a reference, by the way, to Jeremiah 31 in that. So, want to read on that? Go ahead. Anything to add on the second movie, though?
Well, that was about the second movie.
Okay, so now getting into the third, I again haven't started my notes on the third one yet, but this is the things that I paid attention to. Obviously, the recognition of someone as messianic, Christ-like figure is to be an example of a death and resurrection, which of course Poe gives his life in order to defeat the main villain, and then of course returns after defeating him, a la Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 8. Now, the important thing to note in that, and this is where we again have to clarify, the third was definitely my least favorite of the movies because there's just so much that I have to qualify as far as being Hindu as opposed to Christian. But the point of emphasis is the death and resurrection. There is no biblical precedent to say that Jesus combated Satan in hell or suffered any second after what he said in John chapter 19 and verse 30, where he said, "It is finished," tetelestai in Greek. That is a very conclusive and emphatic statement regarding our redemption. There was no more suffering or overcoming to be done in the spiritual realm. What we're told that Jesus did in the realm of the dead was in Ephesians 4:8 that he led captivity captive, literally a victory parade of those whose sins had now been redeemed and were awaiting redemption. You can see in the Gospel of Luke the rich man and Lazarus noting how the afterlife worked before Jesus died for them. But the points that I like to draw as well in the third Kung Fu Panda movie is that the carte blanche death and resurrection is something that we pay attention to about Jesus, not just because he was showing off, but I'm going to probably use that study to emphasize where Poe just kind of did things. He was talented in chi just because reasons. They had the special power just because pandas. Jesus didn't have that power, to note Manuel's cringe about Gnosticism. The reason why Jesus was the Christ and what set him aside as the anointed one, the Messiah, Mashiach in Greek, isn't even necessarily because he's the only one with that name. Those who were anointed ones in the Old Testament were selected for special purposes. They were set aside ones, literally, chosen ones. The ones who were called messiahs in the Old Testament were the prophets, those who were spokesmen for God, the priests, those who were middlemen, intermediators for God, and those who were kings, political representatives of God's authority. Now, Jesus was the capital M Messiah. He was king, prophet, and priest. Who better to represent God's authority and power than God himself? Who better to speak on behalf of God to his people than God himself? Who better to serve as the mediator between God and man than God himself? But the point being made is just that. I'll go into the prophecies and noting that Jesus would have the unique prerogative of his death and resurrection being a redemption for sins, not because he died and came back. People can do that in an entirely secular context with a defibrillator or ongoing medicine to get him out of a coma. What Jesus did in his death and resurrection was a verifiable brain death, a total elimination of body and mind, and then a restoration of body and soul once again, not to, as the Gnostics would argue, show he was pure spirit or to form some bizarre deception, but to emphasize the point that we will be conformed to his glorious body, 1 Corinthians 15, that in 1 John 3, 1 through 3 as well, that we will be like him when we see him. And he didn't show us someone who was absent of body. He literally emphasized, because Gnostics were arguing this, touch me, feel my flesh and my bones. A spirit doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have. And I take the eyewitnesses over the bizarre Redditors of the ancient Roman Empire. So that would be the drive home point, is there was a resurrection in Kung Fu Panda 3. That is the best thing I could emphasize. The reality is Jesus' resurrection was set up a little bit differently than Poe just being the, woke SJW, oh, it's because I was the specially birthed anointed class or whatever. Now, Jesus was uniquely in all of creation to be the one for this purpose and to reveal this about God. The fourth one, again, Manuel hasn't seen it, and you don't really need to bother. If your problem with the first or the second and third was that they just kind of borrowed from the first, that's all the fourth was. It's just kind of baiting on nostalgia. So, yeah, being short isn't a sin. I'll just say that. I don't plan on doing a study on Kung Fu Panda 4.
Oh dear. Yeah, I agree. You even kind of hinted at, and I agree with that as well, that there is even a relation between Gnosticism and communism,
Yeah.
and we see. I already talked about it, and we see that in the third Kung Fu Panda movie, where they kind of get everyone together, right? And that's why communism has that goal. It's like, everyone, the commune comes together, becomes one. That's part of the Gnostic attempt to transcend the material world.
And by the way, you know what else borrows from that theme? Islam.
Tell me. Oh, yeah. I was thinking, should I? But I didn't. I saw it when you just, when you were just saying those things, and you were talking about Jesus and him being spirit and the crucifixion. I was thinking, should I mention Islam? And should I mention that a lot of heresies, and that a lot of heresies are based on this Gnostic heresy, which was one of the first major heresies. So it's all based on that, and of course, a lot of the Islamic viewpoints, which from a Christian perspective are heresies, borrow from that as well,
Mhm.
and um, that's why they get the idea of why it's so important. Why is it so important to Muslims to emphasize that Jesus didn't die on the cross,
Well,
and that's
it's
what.
because the Quran can't be wrong. Surah 4,
Right,
157 states
but why is
Jesus.
that? Yeah, yeah, yeah. But why is that in the Quran to begin with?
Because Muhammad's nickname was the ear. He believed everything he heard. And the Gnostics that were kicked out of the Roman Empire ended up in
Right.
Saudi Arabia. He borrowed those stories, not realizing they were false, and said, "This is the true revelation of Allah."
Exactly, because it's a Gnostic teaching that he picked up.
Mhm.
And why is that a Gnostic teaching? Well, you already explained it basically. Because um, they see Jesus as a spiritual being, basically.
Kind of,
Kind
yeah.
of, kind of like Uguay in the third movie.
Yeah, for those who don't know, the Quran states that when Jesus was born, in a very vulgar and disrespectful retelling of the virgin birth, that when Gabriel told Mary, I haven't been unchaste and all that stuff, that Allah's spirit is going to be breathed on her vagina. Look it up, I'm not kidding. The Arabic word is farj. And he says that the spirit of Allah will be breathed into you and give you a perfect son. And what's interesting as well is Islam ends up granting more than it realizes. Jesus was the only individual not to be touched by Satan and thus given a sinful, rebellious nature. Muhammad had to pray, I think it was almost 70 times a day, according to Sahih Bukhari and Isnad Ahmed, that for his sins to be forgiven, past, present, and future. So the idea of Jesus being a unique individual is something that the Quran doesn't get away from as well as you'd think. If you want a good story and, or I guess, study through the Quran that isn't going to hide those details. This guy, the Bible Mandalorian, is a starting channel on YouTube that I'm following. He's going verse by verse through the Quran. You can check that out. But the point and emphasis, again, in the Islamic perspective of the majority constitutes more power is why they pray in groups in the mosque all selectively. They think because of these Gnostic influences that more participants increases spiritual power and influence. And while we as Christians do grant part of that, we do realize that the prayers we have here have a tangible impact upon the unseen world. For example, in the book of Daniel, chapters 9 and 10, Daniel he has it laid on his heart to pray to God fast, not completely from all food, but just from delicacies and stuff, just bread and water. And during this fast, he just commits himself. He says, I'm going to do it for such and such a number of days. And he didn't know why. He just said, reading Jeremiah, it's almost time for us to go back to the promised land. I got to get my own act together with God, and if others follow, great. Well, when Gabriel came with the famous 70 weeks prophecy, the most direct reference to Jesus' fulfillment in 32 AD of entering the temple exactly when he said he would, it was ultimately to draw attention to that fact. He predicts to the day when Messiah would arrive on a donkey's colt. That donkey detail was provided in Zechariah. But Gabriel tells him that if it wasn't for your prayers, I wouldn't have had the support I needed to get here. The prince, the spiritual authority over Persia, was preventing me from delivering this to you until Michael, your prince, was sent to aid me. And if it was a result of his prayers, the exact time it took for Michael to get there was the same amount of time Daniel was praying for it. He was dispatched immediately, but there is a lot going on that we don't see. What a Gnostic would do is they'd take that 400 steps too far and say that majority prayers then make the spiritual entities much more powerful, and that our attention should solely be on the spiritual entities. And then you end up following lunatics like Michael Heiser and Don Richardson or whoever. But yeah, that would be the point and emphasis on that.
And since we now already mentioned all of that, I'm gonna go full circle because you at the very beginning we talked about my name and not the biblical aspects, but from 1984. And 1984 is, that's my opinion, and I'm probably gonna make a podcast on that as well. That you can do several podcasts just on that. 1984 is, of course, criticizing communism.
Totalitarianism, yeah.
Yeah, but conversely, and a lot of communists told me, no, George Orwell isn't criticizing communism. He was a communist himself.
For those
Right,
listening,
right,
George Orwell wrote a book titled 1984. That's what he's talking
right,
about.
right. But he criticized. It sounds weird, but in a nutshell, he really criticized communism from a communist perspective. And the reason you can do that is because communism is contradictory, and the reason it's contradictory is because it has Gnosticism behind it. Communism itself, you're kind of supposed to be atheist and only believe in the material world. Gnosticism is the opposite. You kind of, so communists are absolute materialists, and Gnostics are absolute idealists. And George Orwell discovered that a lot of the inner party members, to use his terms, uh, a lot of the inner party members, the outer party members are all atheists, but he discovered that the inner party members, so to say, are basically all Gnostics.
Mhm.
So what he's really criticizing in 1984 is actually Gnosticism, and you can see that very well. You know, he he criticizes the party for the book criticizes the fictional communist party in 1984. It criticizes it mainly for
Believing they're an
well,
authority over truth.
for negating objective physical reality. That's what the famous 2 plus 2 equals 5 quote is about.
Yeah, double speak and all
Um,
that.
which is actually that was an actual slogan in the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Stalin came up with that. So George Orwell didn't invent that. They actually used that as a slogan. And why? Because they uh, reject and negate objective physical reality.
Or they think it's irrelevant to the point where you should focus instead totally on the spiritual, which is a very Greek idea, and not to be interwoven with the Bible. Now, with that being said, I've pretty much discussed all that I want to as far as the positives in Kung Fu Panda, and I mean, I appreciate your perspective on the issues to be sensitive for. Um, I'll give just some things to remember and be prepared for in future uploads. My goal in the Bible studies on popular media, once again, is not to claim that they are Christian by intent. My intent is to find Christ in them. There is a difference. Parallel lines never intersect, but they're both heading the same direction, and if that direction is Jesus, I'm all the more for it. If you have to spend more time showing that those lines aren't parallel than the one parallel theme that's in it, or if there's only like a half of a theme that gets something right, then it's probably not going to be worth your time or edification due to the fact that it's at best not going to impact your relationship with God in any way. At worst, it might skew it. We don't want to be cultists. So the point being made is be aware of the things that you're influencing or being influenced by, and that you are an influence. And I think that would be your point, Emmanuel. But at the same time, we should not be reactive, but responsive. Not say it's all Gnostic heresy and that wall is Gnosticism, but being able to say, no, no, no. I want to know what Gnostics claim because there are legitimate errors here, and I want to know the truth from error. So, yeah, as far as Kung Fu Panda is concerned, there are a lot of good things in there. A lot of things that can talk about scripture, a lot of things that talk about Jesus. Also, a lot of not so scriptural things, and you need to be aware of those as well. If you want more on that, feel free to ask in the comments, and we'll give you a chapter and verse from those Buddhist and heretical sources. But understand as well that when it comes to the history behind not just our channels, but that of Christianity, the claims aren't rooted in whoever was the most popular vote. The root isn't in the claim of people who actually put their God's credibility forward. The Gnostics are a parasite that depended on the credibility of the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament apostles who performed miracles to show Jesus was God in the flesh. When the Gnostics come to say, no, God can't be in the flesh, that is not a conclusion based on objective fact. It is an assumption based based on culture that has no credibility, apart from the fact that people think it sounds good. We don't want to follow what sounds good. We want to follow what's true, and that matters. So, any final words, Manuel, before we sign off?
Hmm. Um, well, then, since you mentioned Buddhism, and I know in the last video we did, it was difficult because we had different perspectives on Buddhism. But I just want to say, I don't think Buddhism itself is Gnostic,
Oh no, I
just
don't
like
claim that.
Christianity is itself is Gnostic. So, and I feel I want to address that real fast because I feel a lot of Christians see see Buddhism as a heresy, and I mean I can understand their perspective. And then, of course, as a Christian, you shouldn't be practicing Buddhism. Obviously, you should be practicing Christianity.
We do not
Um,
believe in the Atman reincarnation or the Dukkha.
right. um, but since we talked so much about heresies and occultism and Gnosticism, Madame Blavatsky was very successful at misrepresenting Buddhism as Gnostic, or just misrepresenting Buddhism in general. So yeah, so I just wanted to throw that in.
Yep, always look up the actual sources. That's why we referenced the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhutta Gartiya, the earliest sources on them. Well, thank you for joining us today, Manuel. This will be uploaded on your channel later. I'll try and get this uploaded today. The Time in the Shade episodes are going to continue as long as stupid stuff keeps happening in the world, so look forward to that. And yeah, I'll be looking forward to future conversations. If there's anything you want to challenge or debate, as long as that's the format, I'd be happy to host you in that. If there's any other conversations you want to have on movies coming out that maybe are Gnostic, or heck, why don't we just go to the jugular if you want to do a verse by verse go through of some of the Gnostic writings like the Apocalypse of James or the Acts of Peter. We can talk about some of the more stupid stuff like the talking cross and the two men carrying Jesus' body out of the tomb, and the entire city coming out to see it as opposed to the actual historical event. I'd be happy to host you for that as well.
I'd be happy to be part of it, and I love your Time in the Shade stuff. It's I love that kind of stuff. Keep it up.
Yeah, I'll I'll keep it on hand. But with that said, God bless you all. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all again next time. And if there's any topics you'd like us to discuss as well, let us know in the comments. It'd be an honor. God bless you. We'll see you then.